And welcome to the first IPCal's 50th anniversary celebration of this new academic school year. My name is Sarah Davidson Avenega, and I serve as the Senior Associate Director of International Programs in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. As many of you are aware, in 2013, our International Programs Office is celebrating 50 years of international engagement through a series of colloquia that highlight our connections with partners across the campus and across the globe. Today's lineup of distinguished speakers is an especially true embodiment of those connections. We have Cornell's World Food Prize winners here with us today who draw on years of celebrated experience, as well as alumni from the World Food Prize Global Youth Institute, folks just beginning their studies and their careers. We'll hear today their projections of how to tackle the world's looming agricultural challenges through better policy. After this panel, we invite you to join us in the foyer for lunch. And then after lunch, we'll hear from world-renowned journalists about their process in finding the food security story. Finally, later this afternoon, we'll hear from representatives of our own CALS faculty who are actively engaged in research that will help us realize a more food-secure, stable planet. Following this distinguished panel, we invite all of you and the speakers to join us for a reception in the foyer. Now, to kick off today, I would like to invite our Director of International Programs, Ronnie Kaufman, to introduce a very special guest. Thank you all for coming, and I hope you enjoy the program.
Thank you, Sarah, and let me add my welcome to everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Ambassador Kenneth Quinn, who I've known for many years through my association with the World Food Prize. You know, this guy is a real ambassador. He's not one of these guys that donated a lot of money and got an assignment to Paris. He started out way back in 1968 in the Mekong Delta of Vietnam. And I have some feeling for what it's like because I was a rice breeder in Asia about that time in the early 70s, and one of my first assignments was to go to the Mekong Delta. So we were just talking about, you know, the importance of rice and roads, and he might get into that. But anyway, he goes way back. He's an expert on Indochina. He's fluent in Vietnamese. He spent a lot of time in Vietnam. Just to give you a sample of what he's done, I'm not going to read his CV, but he's gotten a lot of major awards. The Secretary of State's Award for Heroism and Valor for efforts to protect American citizens exposed to danger in Cambodia, and being the only civilian to ever receive the U.S. Army Air Medal for his participation in operations in Vietnam, and the only Foreign Service officer ever to have 3 times received the American Foreign Service Association Rifkin and Harrer Awards for intellectual courage in challenging policy. So you get the idea. He's a real ambassador. He was the ambassador to Cambodia, and really, through Rice and Roads, Ken, I think, responsible for getting the whole Pol Pot group out of that country. He spent 10 years there in the 1990s. He's from Iowa. He's a graduate of Dubuque, Loras College in Dubuque, right? I should have rehearsed that, Kim, sorry. And so he went back to Iowa, and of course the state was already famous. You know, that's where the tall corn grows. You have to watch him, he'll sing the Iowa corn song, because Dr. Borlaug made him practice a lot on that song. The corn's not so tall now, thanks to us plant breeders, but it's still productive, right, Kim? That's right. It's short corn, but hey, you know, it's got what it takes. So he's been there the last 10 years. He's built the World Food Prize absolutely into a global institution that attracts, you know, the whole global community every year in October. If you haven't been there during the event, I would encourage you to go. It's amazing. He's built a home for the prize, taken over the old library in Des Moines and turned it into a beautiful platinum LEED facility, raised more than $30 million to accomplish this. So it's a real pleasure to have him here at Cornell for the first time. Hope you like the weather, Ken. and it's a pleasure to introduce Ambassador Quinn, who's going to lead us through this program.
Thank you, Ronnie. Thank you, Dr. Kaufman's a great friend, and it's wonderful to be here. Sarah, Anna, thank you so much for all the arrangements put in place and to be here. I want to be sure everybody understands that I ended up in the Mekong Delta out with farmers planting rice, not by any act of free will or interest in plant science. I was a political scientist. And I'm from Dubuque, Iowa, Loras College, a little small Catholic college. And not many people who went to Loras got to be in the American Foreign Service, right? That was for Ivy League guys from Harvard and Princeton and Cornell and that. But sometimes we have to be thankful that our government is inefficient, that our government makes mistakes. Because you take a written test, and it's pretty clear to me that somewhere somebody mixed up my scores with the scores of somebody probably from here, and I somehow got in, and I'm off to Washington, and I'm going to, I have these visions of diplomatic sugar plums dancing in my head. Vienna, Paris, London, Denmark if I had to pair, and instead, before I knew what happened, they're training me in Vietnamese because I was under 26, hadn't been in the military, I was unmarried, and there was something called the draft that didn't have anything to do with picking NFL players. But here I am off to Vietnam. But it was the lesson of a life, of my lifetime. And I was out there and I saw firsthand the connection between building rural roads and what miracle rice could do. And it was the beginning of the Green Revolution that Norman Borlaug started. Now, I assume almost everybody here, unlike most audiences I address, knows who Norman Borlaug is or was. The guy was born on a farm in northeast Iowa in Howard County. Made his only mistake in life that he went to the University of Minnesota, not to Iowa State. And I'll come back and talk about that a little bit later. And went off to Mexico and working with the poorest farmers. And Ronnie was his graduate student, his only graduate student he ever had in his Ph.D., working with Norm Borlaug out there as he developed and made that miracle wheat that he would then take to India and Pakistan, and as they were facing imminent mass starvation, and convince both the leaders of both countries to change their whole approach to agriculture. And the result was that hundreds of millions were saved from starvation. He received the Nobel Peace Prize, and he went on from that. And that. Today, September 12th, is the day that marks the 4th anniversary of his death. Yesterday, 9/11, everybody knows where they were on 9/11 when you first found out about that. And I think most of us who know Norm Borlaug, we remember where we were on September 12th in 2009 when the phone call came on that Saturday to say that he's gone. Hard to believe. It was hard to believe, even though we knew how ill he was. But the power of Norm Borlaug is seen now in his legacy. Yesterday in New Delhi, the governor of Iowa, who was there, laid a wreath at the foot of a statue of Norman Borlaug. There's a statue of Norman Borlaug in Mexico at CIMMYT headquarters. And there's another one erected by the Farmers Association in Obregon, where he did his work. Just imagine, how many people in the world are there who get a statue erected to them by farmers associations, much less somebody from another country. And next March 25th, which will mark the 100th anniversary of Norman Borlaug's birth, and it'll also be U.S. National Ag Day. If all the plans go right, we will unveil his statue in the U.S. Capitol. You know, every American state gets to put 2 statues of its greatest heroes in the U.S. Capitol. Iowa has taken out one of its statues and is putting in a statue of Norm Borlaug. And I'm the chair of the committee to raise the money, select the artist. We've done all that. And the work is underway, and it's terrific. I had a picture of the statue, and I showed it to Pedro Sanchez and Per at breakfast and Dr. Kaufman this morning, and they looked at it first and thought it was a photograph. It so captures him. So it's going to be a great moment for agricultural science, that here in the U.S. Capitol will be a man who is arguably among, if not the greatest agricultural scientists of all time. Norm's last words on that last day were, "Take it to the farmer." And earlier that day, as his family was around, he said, "I have a problem." And his daughter, Julie Borlaug-Laube, and who I'm so sorry she couldn't be here today, and his granddaughter, Julie Borlaug, were there, and they said, you know, Georgini said, "Daddy, what is it?" And he said, "What's your problem?" He said, "Africa." And there were the words that summed up Norman Borlaug's life. And because he spent all his life taking it to the farmer, and he spent the last decades of his life trying to bring the Green Revolution to that one continent where it had eluded it, to Africa. Now, Norm created the World Food Prize, and some of you may not know too much about that, because he wanted there to be a Nobel Prize for agriculture, for food and agriculture. And he went to the Nobel Committee and said, get one started right away. And they had a lot of excuses. They didn't have the money. It wasn't in Alfred Nobel's will. And so, you know, being a determined Norwegian from Iowa, he got it done, had it started. And 1986, and it's been in business since 1987. And it's basically 3 things. It's a $250,000 prize that we give each year in the Iowa State Capitol. Wonderful ceremony, and I hope all of you can come and sign up. It's always on or about World Food Day, October 16th, so October 16th to 18th. We have a 3-day symposium where we try to bring attention to the great issues. When I first started, there was maybe 50 people came from outside of Iowa to the World Food Prize. Most of them were people close to Norm, like Dr. Kaufman. And but now last year we had about 1,100 from 65 countries. Bill Gates gave his first ever speech on agriculture in Africa at the World Food Prize. His staff called us up. Rajiv Shah called me up when he's still working for him there and said, you know, Ken, we've been to the World Food Prize and we're so amazed that we meet a more diverse array of people at the World Food Prize in Des Moines than any other conference we go to anywhere in the world. So Mr. Gates is getting ready to give his first speech, and he'd like to do it at the World Food Prize. Can you have a place for him to do that? I said, oh, Raj, wish you had called me a little earlier. Program's pretty full. You know, I didn't do that, right? I was in the Newark airport last night with defibrillators everywhere. They're a really good idea, because when I had been revived, I said, of course, and that. But the World Food Prize is an award, it's a symposium, and it's a youth program. It's a high school program. And that's the way the World Food Prize and Norm's dreams live on. One of Norm's dreams was that he wanted to recognize and inspire great achievements, that the achievements the world would need as we would enter the 21st century. And 3 of the winners of our prize are here today at this table. And I had the pleasure of calling each of them. Now, you heard from Dr. Kaufman that I'm a guy raising a lot of money, and often they don't know who I am. 2001, when I called Pinstrup-Andersen to call him. I think he thought I was raising money or something, and his secretary didn't want to put the call through for the longest time. I finally had to show up in person at his office to tell him he'd won the World Food Prize. Same thing with Dr. Pedro Sanchez and Dr. Colin McClung on that. The last 50 to 60 years are the single greatest period of food production and hunger reduction in human history. And Norman Borlaug was leading the way. I like to think of him as the captain, and our laureates are the all-star team of that period. Per Pinstrup-Andersen from Denmark, educated at Oklahoma State University, and then through his career, in particular his leadership at IFPRI and the 2020 vision, and his work in influencing policy in South Asia and North Africa changed and turned the tide there in terms of food security for so many people. Pedro Sanchez, native of Cuba, comes to the United States very early, and that with his family, having to start whole new lives, comes to Cornell, gets his degrees here, and a graduate of Cornell, goes to North Carolina State University, and then works in tropical soils and agriculture in South America. And they're at the forefront. How can soils be made more productive? Carrying on work in the upper Amazon, in Peru, in the Cerrado, and then to Africa. And as the head of the ICRAF and agricultural forestry, and the powerful work that can be done in terms of the synergies developed between trees and plants and how to restore the soils of Africa. Colin McClung, also a graduate of Cornell University, and his work in pioneering work in the Cerrado in the 1950s, where he goes and is the first person there to discover what's the formula about how can we treat these soils, and starts a process that then becomes fulfilled in the 1970s and 80s when the Brazilian government moves to open the Cerrado, this great savanna that had been unproductive, and turns out being then the largest amount of land brought into production in the 20th century, and such a model there for Africa as well. And Dr. Pinstrup-Andersen then coming to Cornell on the faculty. So here's the thing you have to know about Cornell and the World Food Prize laureates and the World Food Prize. We keep track of what institutions produce our laureates. And the land-grant institutions, and God bless Justin Morrill and President Lincoln for their vision in 1862, have produced 3/4 of our laureates in one way or another. And Kansas State University and Cornell are tied for the number of graduates they have. Each has produced 3 graduates who have won the World Food Prize. But Cornell also has 2 faculty members, Bob Chandler, who was the man who really started the whole CGIAR system, was on the faculty here. And I, of course, need to mention John Niederhauser, who was another of our laureates and who was a graduate of this wonderful institution. And Dr. Kaufman's a member of our Council of Advisors. So you got 6. So Cornell is far and away the leading institution in the world in terms of producing members of the all-star team of the single greatest period of food production and hunger reduction in human history. You all deserve a hand for that. And that's why I'm here. Another of Norm's dreams were defeating rust disease. He told me his dream was someday somebody will figure out how you take that trait in rice that keeps rice from having rust disease, plant it into wheat, and protect wheat forever. Dr. Kaufman is leading the Borlaug Global Rust Initiative that's here, that's out doing this work around the world and carrying on Norm's legacy. Now, I have to tell you one story. The first anniversary of Norman Borlaug's death, we were in Mexico for the dedication of that first statue. And Dr. Kaufman and I were there. So it's March, I guess it was on the anniversary of his birth. We were there, the statue was being unveiled, and there was a big dinner that night put on by the Farmers Association. In March, right? It was also the night that Cornell was playing in the round of 16 in the NC2A basketball tournament. And so he and I are there in the corner, pretending like we're talking about important World Food Prize business. Under the edge of the table, he's got his cell phone, which is connected to video, and we're watching the game. Now, the other thing you have to know about Dr. Kaufman is he's from Kentucky. And Cornell was playing Kentucky that night. Now, I want you all to know I was cheering for Cornell. You may want to talk to him afterwards to find out for whom he was cheering. I don't know. Third thing that Norm was passionate about was inspiring the next generation of young people to be part of the generation we would need to take on the greatest challenge human beings have ever faced. And that is, can we sustainably produce food to feed 9 billion people by the year 2050? And we have a World Food Prize Youth Institute. So I have these events where I've got laureates and ministers of agriculture and Bill Gates and Kofi Annan and Ban Ki-moon. And we run in 150 high school students and 150 high school teachers. And we get them from around the United States at state youth institutes, like the New York State Youth Institute, which is going to happen this Saturday. And thank you so much to Francine Jasper, and I don't know if she's here, but for all of her work, and there you are, in doing that. Thank you so much for what you're doing. And Keegan Kautsky and Catherine Swoboda from my staff are down here. They work on this. You have 30% of the entire World Food Prize staff is in this room right now. No, truly. And we have 3 of those products who have come through that program here from your area with us today on this program. At the far end over there is Cynthia Ulbing, and she's goes to Ithaca College and grew up around here, went to Newfield High School, is a graduate, as all 3 of them are, of the New Visions program, which is this terrific program to inspire young people. And we sent her, we get these high school kids in Des Moines. We have a room like this. We throw them all in and stir and mix. And then we pick the 22 best and we send them for 8 weeks to work at International Agricultural Research Center. She's just back from Beijing. She spent 8 weeks at the Chinese Academy of Agricultural Science working on climate change issues in China. Alyssa Pritts is here in the middle. Raise your hand, Alyssa. And she's a junior at Cornell. She was at our Global Youth Institute in Des Moines in 2011. She's a development sociology and international development major, and said she went to Trumansburg High School, which I've heard interesting stories about Trumansburg this morning.
Best basketball team in the region.
Is that right? Wow. Okay. And on that, and Alden Morris, who is here. Alden is from Lansing, New York, is at SUNY ESF in Syracuse. He's in environmental science and forestry major. Norm Borlaug would love that. Norm was a forestry major, and he's going to be a landscape architect. Now, if Norm Borlaug could be here this morning, he'd tell you a couple of things. First thing is he'd tell you how happy he is that wrestling's in the Olympics, because Norm Borlaug was a wrestler at the University of Minnesota, and he loved wrestling, and he would have loved to have been at the NC2A championships in Des Moines last March, where the premier event, now I'm going to see how much you all know here, the premier event that I watched glued to the TV was when Kyle Dake won his 4th national championship, the Cornell wrestler. So yeah, all right. And he was, Norm, I think of Norm Borlaug is, of all the NC2A athletes who have ever played a sport at any college, at any level through history, he is probably in terms of life accomplishments, the greatest NC2A athlete ever. And he relished that. Now, the other story I have to tell you is about President Skorton. And I checked carefully, and I know he's not on campus today, so I can tell this story, not get in trouble. He was president of the University of Iowa before he came here, and before you stole him away from us. And it was a good move by you. He was a terrific intellectual leader. So just imagine we're at this event in 2004. I'm sitting next to David Skorton, and we're honoring Norman Borlaug, and we show this video. And Norm Borlaug's walking in Uganda in some project, and he's wearing his University of Minnesota jacket. And Skorton explodes, and he says, "What's that?" I said, I'm sorry, Mr. President Skorton, we got it from ABC, and what could I do, and all this, So the next day, I'm driving Norm Borlaug and Chris Doswell, his aide-de-camp, to Moline to go to visit John Deere, and my cell phone rings. And I answer it, and I said, "Hello?" And he says, "David Skorton." "Yes, President Skorton." "What size jacket does Norman Borlaug wear?" So I'm driving on I-80, not as much traffic as there is on the New York thruway here, but I'm looking in the back seat trying to measure Norm while I'm driving. I said, I think adult medium. And he says, "I'm sending him an Iowa jacket. I don't ever want to see him in a Minnesota jacket when he's in the state of Iowa again." And next time Norm showed up, he had the Iowa jacket on. So that's the power of President Skorton. So the other thing I know about David Skorton is how international he is, and he wants to make Cornell even more international. And so to shape our panel's discussion, I posed the question to these 6 individuals, and I said, just imagine that it's August of 2013, last month, and you got a call to come to David Skorton's office. And you showed up there and he said, "I've just been given the opportunity to address the G20 in St. Petersburg. And if you haven't given me much time, but this is a great moment, a great opportunity. And I want to talk to them about agricultural development. And what's the one thing I should tell them they should do as a group, or any one of them should do in his or her individual country? What's that one thing? Because I only have time to tell them one thing." So that's the question. And now I'm going to go sit down, and we're going to hear the answers to see what they've come up with and what they tell President Skorton. So, knowing David Skorton as I do, you'd think, well, who should I have speak first? The laureates, and they'll come. They're the ones who have all these accomplishments. He'd say, no, I'm going to have the students come first. And so I'm going to turn to Alyssa, to you, and you're on for your time with David Skorton.
I just want to first start by saying thank you. It's really a privilege to be sitting here right now. When I was first posed with this question, I started by rereading the paper that I wrote 3 years ago when I attended the World Food Conference. And then I wrote about the importance of education in alleviating food security in Afghanistan. Since then, I've taken many classes at Cornell, and I had the opportunity to go to India with the IRD class, and I just spent my last summer interning at an orphanage in Guatemala, all of which has expanded my understanding of the world. But even still, I still see the critical value of using education as a tool to alleviate hunger and food security. Because there's just so many different points of impact. You can educate people to more effectively, sustainably, and efficiently use the resources that they already have, like teaching them more sustainable farming practices to produce high-quality fruits and vegetables. You can educate people about new technologies and practices, like the GMOs and the hybrid seeds that are being developed at places like Cornell. I'd also like to put under this category revaluing of old technology and practices. I know at Cornell there's been a lot of recent research with biochar, which was found in the Amazonian rainforest used by indigenous people in the Amazon. And I think there's a lot to value by looking back and look back at a time where we did live sustainably with the world and kind of incorporate that into these new technologies. You can also educate people to inspire innovation and creative use of existing resources. A lot has been done with microfinancing, and has been shown when you give people the capital, they can really do creative and innovative things to improve their livelihoods. You can also educate people to promote more informed decision-making about their health, their food choices, their finances to allocate money to buy food, community development. When we were in India, we sat in on some self-help groups that work to educate women to put them in positions of political power. And they found when they did this, not only did the woman's livelihood improve, but that of her family as well, and the whole community. So there's a lot of value in that. Another example I have personally is when I was in Guatemala this summer at the orphanage, I ate the same food as the kids. And even though the orphanage did not take any money from the government, they still had to follow the government guidelines, which included a menu made by the nutritionist at the orphanage. And personally, I did not find the menu very nutritious at all. I remember one day we had just beans and eggs as our breakfast and our dinner. And so I think there can be a lot of value in educating people on what exactly is a healthy diet and incorporating more fruits and vegetables into their diet. And I think my last point, which is possibly the most important, is we cannot forget to educate citizens of developed countries about how their decisions can greatly impact the livelihoods of people all over the world. I think this last point is one that I face personally every single day, where in my generation, even though we have the internet and we have all these resources to educate ourselves about all these issues, many of my peers are still very uninformed about where their food comes from, how it is picked, how it is produced, and how it gets to the grocery stores that they shop at. I had a roommate at Cornell that was very smart in the engineering school, and she had no idea that the tomato that she was consuming in the middle of winter was most likely picked in a farm in Mexico and by someone who made less than a minimum wage and then shipped all the way to this little Wegmans in Ithaca. And then even if you're like someone like me who's relatively aware of these issues, I can't afford to eat sustainably because it's just out of my budget of a college student. I think this invisibility of the supply chain seems extremely detrimental to me to progress. And it's frustrating because we have the infrastructure and we have the resources and the means to educate our citizens, but not enough is being done. It wasn't until I participated in the New Visions program at Cornell, my senior year of high school, that I was ever formally taught about any of these issues of food security and climate change and sustainability. So I really think that this needs to be incorporated into public schools and into educating the youth and fellow peers. So I just wanted to close by kind of sharing a story from my time spent in Guatemala this summer that I think really illustrates this point of the importance of education. So although I worked at an orphanage, only 4 out of the 104 children who lived there were true orphans. Most had parents. They were just alcoholics or abusive or just didn't have the means to support their kids or any combination of the three. And about 3 weeks into my internship, we received a group of 4 siblings. There was 2 3-year-old twins, a 5-year-old, and a 7-year-old. And these kids were extremely stunted. I think the 3-year-olds, which I lived with, were about the height of a healthy 1.5-year-old here. So extremely malnourished and stunted. So I accompanied them to their first custody hearing. So the courtroom had this open air reception area where you'd kind of just watch everyone checked in. And so I observed this mother and her first kind of interaction with her children since they'd been taken from her. And as you can imagine, it was a very emotional moment. She was accompanied by two men, which I later found out were both fathers of her children. And then she also had another child strapped to her back, which looked to be about 4 months old. So I asked the social worker how old the mother was, and she said 22. I quickly did the math in my head and realized that her first child was born when she was 15 years old. And I kind of reflected on my life at 15 and how my biggest complaint was probably that my parents wouldn't let me watch a rated R movie. And that really put things into perspective for me. I'd lived in a very supportive household, which had always told me the value of my education, and I had sexual education classes already at 15, and then I thought more like, okay, 20 years old, that's how old I am now. She had already had 4 children, and here I am at Cornell University, having all this education, being taught that to make educated, smart life decisions. And so ultimately, in the end, she didn't get her kids back. And I was asked to carry her 3-year-old daughter, Emily, back to the car. And the mother came running up to me and grabbed my arms, and she's like, "Why are you doing this to me? I love my child. I love you, Emily. Please don't take my kid away from me. I love you." And I was forced to just walk away and bring her kid into the car. And I looked back, and she was collapsed on the ground, just sobbing. And at that moment, I just found it very hard to believe that she wanted to neglect her kids, and she wanted her kids to be in this environment. Maybe if she had the opportunity like I did to improve her education, she would understand that she has the potential to have a higher paying job and to know how to properly feed and support her children. And you wait to have children and use birth control. And she wouldn't be experiencing so much pain at this moment, and her kids wouldn't be without a family. So I understand that many people don't have the means or the desire to travel, or that this is the most sustainable way to do things. But I feel that in order for the world to become more food secure, we have to inspire people, just as I have been inspired, to really care about humanity, the environment, for the well-being of future generations. And this will not happen if the supply chains of food continue to be invisible. We live in a world where each decision we make has a global consequence. And only when people understand these consequences will food be produced in a more sustainable way and marketed at affordable prices. And I believe that humans are compassionate and caring people and do not want to put their children in unhealthy environments or lifestyles. They just need to be educated about how exactly their votes, purchases, and lifestyles are impacting themselves, each other, and the health of the world for the future.
Oh, good. Thank you. Thank you, Alyssa. That's good. I could hear David Scorton telling that story at the G20. Alden Morris, we'll turn to you.
Thank you very much.
President Scorton, we'll see you now.
And I just want to say, Alyssa, that was kind of beautiful. I think that these kind of personal kind of life memories and kind of things that you experience, that's what truly kind of bring about the picture. And I also think it's a privilege that I was allowed to speak in front of all you guys, being in between these amazing people. But when asked the question of how are we going to feed all these people by 2050, such a short amount of time, kind of the first thing people are going to look at is kind of increased production, kind of use more land, we can get more crops, and we're going to try to fix the problem that way. But I don't think it's the higher amount of crops, I think it's the efficiency at which we plant crops. And to put it simply, kind of, looking to decrease food waste by increasing current food production system efficiency. So efficiency kind of being that kind of main term. And then looking at this specifically because it's a cheap option. And if you want to produce for the masses in such a short amount of time, you want to look at cheap. something that's not going to be intricate, very complicated, new technology that's going to need a large learning curve, but something that's just very quick and simple. And why food waste? Because as of right now, 1/3 of all food production is going straight into the trash, straight into waste. And that actually accounts to 1.3 billion tons of food. And that's just a massive amount. And when you kind of look at food efficiency, you really have to break up our kind of population into the developed countries and into the underdeveloped countries, because they're two completely different worlds because of the amount of time they have, the amount of money they have, and the amount of people and resources that are available to them. And with underdeveloped countries specifically, looking at information availability, education, and then also increasing current technology implementation. Kind of what Alyssa was saying with the technology and what we have now, but kind of making it more efficient being the key term again. And some examples are, before the seed is even in the ground, having that information out there to what plant is going to thrive in what soil type, what composition, what water availability there is in that area, so that people aren't just buying the cheapest seed available, but maybe spending just a little bit more to get a much larger output in the long run. And then when planting, going back to information with the correct planting depth, the spacing between planting the seeds, and that's going to give us the highest efficiency of germination rather than just crude amount, which is going to be wasting seeds, which costs a lot of money. And then where a lot of the waste occurs within underdeveloped countries is with the packaging and movement of goods. Because you can imagine there's not much money, so everything is kind of whatever is available, you kind of use it. And with with packaging, kind of going to newer technologies actually, with weather resistant, temperature tolerant, new ways of transporting with bags or boxes possibly, but implementing it in a kind of a cheaper way with possibly subsidies or some sort of other aid. And then looking at the second part of that with the movement, and that's infrastructure. I would say specifically roads and security, getting from point A to point B and having it actually get there and not be hijacked by outside areas or something like that. Now, turning to developed countries, it's a whole new world. And here I think, again, information, but more or less polished policy initiatives, and specifically looking at quality standards, because our quality standards are very high, and that's leading to a lot of waste. And a lot of it is with the longevity of which businesses and companies can keep their food out before they have to throw it away. And that goes back to FDA standards, just what the general public would like to see. And I think instead of just throwing it away, I think you could possibly kind of reuse, this term of reuse, and donate to charities or food banks so that they can keep in mind perishability, but they can give it to like different parts of the community that otherwise won't be seeing any type of food. And then the second problem would be overproduction. We overproduce, and then what we don't use, we just throw it away. And I think if you analyze where your wastes are, and then you gather the data, you plot the results, and then you implement new strategies, so you can actually see how much food you actually need, so you can kind of judge it based on just looking at a graph or something. And UC Berkeley's food waste prevention program was actually very successful with this. They spent $35,000 on 4 machines within their main dining halls for the college students, and they would analyze the food type, the amount, and the cost at which it is. And by analyzing this using the statistics that the computer generated, they were able to reduce waste by 43%. Now, 43% within a university, that's massive, that's millions. That's just amazing. But even without $35,000 computers, just simple record keeping, I think can have the same result, same beneficial result. And kind of to conclude, decreasing food waste, not only is that going to feed more people, but it's going to decrease other impacts that we have on the world, such as landfill space. Because in America, actually, we're spending $1 billion every year just to get rid of this food waste. Not even to produce this food, just to get rid of it. And then in underdeveloped countries, having that correct information on the seed selection, planting distribution, so that we can maximize growth and efficiency. And then in developed, kind of this term of recycling food within our community, within the area, and then tracking food and making sure that we can implement strategies which decreases our general overuse and overproduction.
Okay, so education, yeah. Efficiency, okay, so Poor Cynthia has been sitting out in the waiting room, waiting to go into Dr. Scorton's office. But what you don't know is that she had some connections through me to friends I have at the National Security Agency. And so she's been able to watch both of these presentations in Dr. Scorton's office through whatever means they have these days. They seem to know everything, so it might be for a good purpose. So now she's able to go in and make her pitch to Dr. Scorton on that. So Cynthia, you're on.
All right, I'll put this mic over here to my little 5'3" self. Hi everybody. At the risk of sounding like a broken record, it's really an honor to be here today on this panel with 3 World Food Prize laureates and with Ambassador Quinn, the man who made my mother cry in the airport as she clung on to me as I left for Beijing this past June.
Very good.
And so as far as it goes for addressing the G20, as apparently I've been theoretically accepted to do, I think that if it comes down to one policy, it's really about the redistribution of resources and of food. And if you've spent more than a day in Ithaca, you've probably kind of heard the battle cry of the liberal working class to spread the wealth. But it really is important when you look at it on a global global scale, because we have enough food right now to feed 10 billion people, which is the population peak we expect by 2050. We produce enough to satisfy the caloric intake of those people. It's just where that food is going and how it's being distributed, and as a result, why we still have over 900 million starving people in this world. Whether it's, as Alden touched on, just the waste of food, and not to bog everybody down with the statistics, but almost 40% of food produced in the United States gets thrown away in the end, it gets wasted. And 30 to 40% of food in many developing countries goes through the same problem because of just whether it's in storage or in transit, it spoils, or it doesn't get where it needs to go. And so it's really important that we have the resources to get this food out and to prevent it from spoiling before it gets to its ultimate destination. And I think in this hypothetical situation, the G20 could have a lot of play with this, because while the G20 does represent a variety of the world's countries, both developing and developed, it represents nearly 85% of the world's economy, kind of in its definition, and about 84% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So with 98% of the world's hungry and developing countries, the majority of starving people are not represented in the G20, but the G20 definitely represents where most of the food is, as opposed to where it needs to get. So in simple, I believe it's about food distribution policies, the resources that are necessary to get food to its ultimate destination and to people, and about really prioritizing. A lot of industry-produced crops will be used in unsustainable methods, whether it's excessive growing of livestock, when that really isn't always the most sustainable way to farm. If you look at like caloric ratios of how many calories it takes to produce however many calories of meat, a lot of that is not quite sustainable, and a lot of it also goes to biofuel. So I think that when you look at where people's priorities are and what we need versus what we want, I think that more equally distributing the food throughout the world will be able to lead to more sustainable development by 2050.
Okay, thank you. So one thing I know for sure, Norm Borlaug was here, he'd be so proud of the 3 of you and all other students who are in here, high school students, what you've been able to do, and you've set the bar pretty high now for our laureates. They're probably thinking about how do we get into this situation? How did Ken Quinn do this to me again? But so I'm going to now turn in order of their laureatedom to for comments, and turn to the 2001 World Food Prize laureate, Dr. Per Pinstrup-Andersen. Per?
Okay.
Let me have the mic here, so if I need to, he's taking that one from me.
Don't give him the mic. Thank you very much, Ken. It's wonderful to be part of this panel, and I agree with you. We've heard 3 outstanding presentations, and it's going to be very difficult to follow. There are so many issues and so little time. I believe the most important barrier to achieving sustainable food security for all, whether it's today or by 2050, is insufficient investment by governments in infrastructure and institutions, particularly infrastructure and institutions in rural areas of low-income developing countries. And I'm talking about roads, feeder roads. I'm talking about primary health care in rural areas. I'm talking about primary education. I'm talking about irrigation facilities, institutions to guide land tenure, institutions to guide a number of other things, farmer associations, and so on and so forth. Without those investments, the efficient and competitive private sector that is essential to achieve food security will not be able to thrive. And I think it's very important that we kill the idea that it's either the public sector or the private sector that has to solve the food security problem. It's a combination of the two. It takes a certain amount of infrastructure and institutions that we in the United States and Europe take for granted because we have it. It takes that kind of thing for the private sector to do its job, and if the private sector doesn't do its job, food security will not be achieved. So what is it that the G20 can do? Well, Cynthia already described the G20. It's a group of rich countries. The membership consists of 19 of the world's 25 richest countries and the European Union. There is no formal representation by poor countries in this group. The group was created in 1999 in order to help deal with the world's financial problems. In 2008, it became a group of state leaders, heads of state of these 19 countries, plus the head of the EU. The World Bank, IMF heads are always involved in the meetings and so on. So. Usually I talk too loudly. I guess today I'm not excited enough. So what is it that the G20 can do? Basically 3 things. One, it can help set global governance guidelines and hope to have them implemented through existing institutions, because G20 does not have implementing capacity as a group. But it can, for example, help convince WTO to have different trade arrangements. It can help try to come up with binding agreements for international land acquisition, for example, and a number of other things like this. Secondly, the G20 membership can try to clean up its own act. For example, by reducing the emission of greenhouse gases. Most of the greenhouse gases come from the G20 membership. It can deal with some of the unsustainable management of natural resources. That they can do by themselves. They can implement that if they can agree to do it. The third thing they can do is to provide support for the low-income countries to do the kinds of things that are necessary for improving food security. And I have already mentioned my favorite thing, since I can only mention one, and that is investment in rural infrastructure and rural institutions. Much of that has to be done by governments. The G20 can help poor countries by making available assistance, both in the form of money and in the form of technical assistance. There is a precedence for that at a meeting in Italy, in L'Aquila, Italy, a few years ago. G20 agreed to commit $20 billion to improve food security and promote agricultural development in low-income developing countries. Some of that money has forthcome, some has not, but at least there is a precedence for doing that kind of thing. So I believe that is what Dr. Scorton should be telling G20. There are many, many other things that they can do, but that, it seems to me, is going to have the greatest impact. Now let me just finish by trying to give the justification for this. imagine a small farmer, a smallholder farmer who doesn't have access to reasonably priced fertilizers and other inputs because the markets don't work, because the institutions are not in place, because the roads are not functioning. That same farmer gets very low prices for what she produces over and beyond what is needed for the family because the roads are not there. If you have to carry 100 kgs of maize or corn on your head 20 kilometers or 20 miles before you can get to a place where you can sell it, you're not going to do a lot of this. And if you try, you're going to run out of energy very quickly. So these small farmers, these smallholder farmers are in a straitjacket as if the institutions and the infrastructure are not there. The supply chain agents won't make investments because they can't make money. The result of not having these institutions and this infrastructure in place is that you're going to have very high cost food and you're going to continue to have poverty. And of course that means, combining those two means you're going to have a lot of food insecurity. Let me end, Ken, on a clarifying point. What I'm suggesting to President Scorton is not that he should go to G20 and say, here's what you have to do to increase the pile of food in the world. That's not the goal. That's the means to an end. It is not the end. The end is to make sure that everybody has access to enough food to be healthy. There are lots of examples where there's a tremendous amount of food being produced and a tremendous number of hungry and food insecure people. Just look at India right now with almost 80 million tons of grain in stock and millions of people who don't get enough to eat. By the way, if you're wondering what a pile of 80 million tons of grain looks like, imagine 3 million 18-wheelers full of grain. And then imagine all these many people who don't get enough to eat. So producing more food is necessary but not sufficient. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I know Norm Borlaug would be thrilled because he would believe so much in rural roads and power of it. And so I wanted to suggest to Dean Catherine Boer, wouldn't it be great on that big wall back there, nothing on it, and if you put up a map of the world and you put on it the world hunger map that showed you where all the hungriest places are in the world, and then superimpose on top of it the world highway and rural roads map, and then on top of that superimpose the places where terrorism and insurgency breeds. And I assure you that you'll see that where the roads start to end is where the biggest hunger, underdevelopment, and insurgency and terrorism begins. And so it would be a terrific thing. I know Dean Boer has other things to spend money on, but that would be a wonderful analytical thing. Next, the 2002 World Food Prize laureate, who Dr. Pedro Sanchez, known for his work in soil science. He's got a terrific thing now called Soil Doc. But at the World Food Prize, he's known for the incredible Cuban dancing that went on the stage on the night that he received the World Food Prize. It's 2,500 people at C.Y. Stevens in Ames. Ray Charles had just played. And then we had a Cuban mariachi band, and Dr. Borlaug, I think, was dancing with Pedro's sister up there. Iconic moment in the history of the World Food Prize. Pedro?
Thank you, Ken. Thank you. I'd like to answer the question very explicitly. I was looking at that baby whose mother walked away from this location, and thinking that that baby will be 37 years old by the year 2050. I'm looking at my fellow students here in the panel, and I think they will be about 57 years old when at 2050, at the peak of their professional life in many cases. So, looking at that, I have one long-winded answer, which is G20, please make it possible to have a world compact, agreement, whatever, and the ways of enforcing it that would do the following: double or triple food crop yields worldwide, together with improving micronutrient nutrition and efficiency across the entire value chain from the soil to the stomach. Now that's my story. I know it involves many other things that have been said here, such as infrastructure and waste reduction, but that's, I think, it's probably the simplest way to do it. It's not a simple answer. But I'm going to stop there, and I'm not going to discuss the answer anymore. I'll just repeat it once more. Double or triple yields in each country, food crop yields, assuring improved micronutrient nutrition and assuring efficiency in the value chain from the soil to the stomach. Now, somebody has to say something about crop yields. So what do I mean by doubling or tripling yields? That means that Africa can go from 1 metric ton per hectare of current crop yields to 3. Now that's going, in American terms, from 16 to 48 bushels per acre of corn, which is, it's just ridiculous. It means that the United States at the other end would go from 10 to probably 16, 20 tons per hectare. That's from 160 bushels to 320 bushels or so. Perfectly feasible. Now, it varies in all cases, but that's a basis. That's a basis that I wanted to tell you. Now, I was struck by Norman Borlaug's almost last words, that he has this problem and it's Africa. I think we can begin to tell now Norman Borlaug's, just 3 years after his death, 3 or 4, Ken?
Yeah.
4 years after his death, that things are happening. And things are beginning to happen that would make him very happy if he were alive. Not only are crop yields increasing to that level all over Africa, but stunting is being reduced. Children, especially girls, are going to school more, and there is a reverse migration. Many Africans in the United States, Europe, and so on are coming back. That is due, in my opinion, first for having much better governance in Africa. We have only 2 or 3 bad dictators left, and the fact that they care about their people and have taken the will, and the private sector is moving into Africa and growing, especially the indigenous private sector, in ways that we have never seen before. And all that is part of that. In 2004, Kofi Annan, then Secretary General of the UN, called for a uniquely African green revolution, because Norman Borlaug's green revolution essentially bypassed Africa. And that made increase in productivity, of course, dealing with improved seeds, soils, and water as limiting factors, but also improved nutrition, improve everything done in ecologically sound ways, and with a proper enabling policy. I think Kofi Annan can begin to see that, and I said I wish Norman Borlaug could see it. And I also would like to tell you that there is now a clear equivalent of Norman Borlaug in the African Green Revolution. And his name is Akin Adesina, the current Nigerian Minister of Agriculture and Rural Development, formerly with the Rockefeller Foundation, Bob Hurt, and AGRA, and many CGIAR centers. Akin is leading a real green revolution now in Nigeria, a country of over 150 million people, about half the population of the United States, and crammed into, let's say, the states of New Mexico and Arizona here. And the country, as corrupt as can be and so on. All that is turning around by a few determined leaders. And we're delighted to see that, and the influence in other countries will be tremendous. Now, I want to talk about my Cornell connection, because I came here as a Cuban high school graduate, actually a bit involved in supporting the Castro Revolution against the dictatorship at that time. And I came out of here 10 years later, just already plugged into the international agricultural development business. And when I asked my professor, Niall Brady, head of agronomy was called then, that I wanted to do a Ph.D. in tropical soils, he said, sorry, Pedro, we don't have anything like that. And I said, turn around, sir, and look at that Cornell motto in your bag that says, I will find an institution where anybody can get instruction in any study. So Brady said, well, okay, let's see. Come, get your master's degree. If you get good grades and all that, I think we'll send you to the Philippines. And there, I think you can learn tropical soils on your own. And this did happen. And did happen because there was something called the International Agricultural Development Program then that was just starting. I owe this to the director, Ken Turk, may he rest in peace, and to Larry Seidema, present here as his assistant, who made a lot of things open. Larry, get out, would you? Because you are responsible for a lot of this. I was, a couple of days ago, at Columbia University, my institutions, we inaugurated a new Agricultural and Food Security Center. Dean Catherine Bohr was there, and there was a very embarrassing moment for me, which was when somebody said, oh, well now an Ivy League institution, Columbia, has agriculture. And I said, oh my God. So, and John Dyson, who's well known to many of you, was there, and he was chairing a session, and he had an umbrella, and the umbrella, he put it out and said Cornell. So we didn't have the chance to correct whoever said that, but I must tell you that I wear my Cornell hat with pride, with very much pride.
Okay, Pedro. So Dr. Scorton's ready for you, Colin. You're the man with the most seniority. I'm going to say the oldest, but who's been associated with Cornell the longest, and he saved you for last. You'll have the words of wisdom about what he should say to those G20 leaders.
Thank you, Ken. Let me first say I very much appreciated being included here. I don't move around as much as I used to. My next birthday, I'll be 90 years old.
Whoa.
And you slow down when you get to that age. But we have a small farm up in Cayuga County, and I've been able to see things at sort of the grassroots level. That's a very good agricultural area. Most people think of New York, they think of Manhattan. But we're a long way from Manhattan. Yeah. But we have a sort of a society that, in terms of what they do, is more like Iowa than it is like people's concept of New York. They get good yields up there, and there's quite a bit of variation in the soil because of the glacial background of it. You can find a field with pH of, let's say, 5 or 5.5 one place, and you move over a little bit and you find one that is 8.2, and then you may go to another one that says 4.2. And maybe the one that's so acid was a little lake or pond that had a kind of infill that was very acidic, and it was frozen, and then it was finally mixed up with other mud and dumped in the middle of a small farm. You may find 4 or 5 of those in the same farm. And that's not an easy problem to deal with, but it can be done. But my view on the situation of the world future on, let's say, the next 50 years. In fact, 2050 was a number that showed up. I might say I was with the Rockefeller Foundation or the Rockefeller family philanthropies for 37 of my 43 years in agricultural research. And from that background, the first assignment I had was to go to Brazil and find a solution to the decline of those soils under cropping. They were, the two brothers, Delson and David, were particularly concerned with that because that's the only export of any significance that Brazil had in those days. They didn't have enough food of some things, and they didn't produce enough wheat. In fact, they were net importers of agricultural products, except for coffee and some cotton that they exported. Well, we were able to find a solution to that because those soils are so old and so highly leached that even the primary minerals have disappeared from the profile. Very, very poor and very acid with a low pH. Not the amount of lime required to bring them up to a more satisfactory level or to a good level is not that great because it's not a very high exchange capacity on the average. Then apply lime and then a number of fertilizers, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium and magnesium, sulfur, boron, sometimes molybdenum. We found deficiencies of all those things. But if you, with a fairly simple program, they're not all the same, mind you, but they were all in the same sort of category. And you could go from essentially, let's say, zero production of maize, of corn per acre, to a good level, let's say 100 bushels to the acre. And over time, it would increase from that. You can move into a profitable situation with cotton even in the first year. And with a little bit of attention, within 5 or 10 years, you'd be increasing up to, let's say, 2 or 3 bales of lint cotton per acre. So then they have increased their production to the point now. Well, there was a little article in the Wall Street Journal the 1st of August, in which and I'm interested to see if the gentleman that's going to be here from the Wall Street Journal is the guy that wrote it, because it says Brazil has discovered it, and then he went on to say that it was going to be the highest producer of soybeans in the world. It was the first country other than, well, it was in the U.S. from the beginning.
Right. A lot of people in Iowa worried about that at the Iowa Soybean Association. I was in a lot of trouble when you and the two Brazilians got the World Food Prize. I had to have personal protection for about a month or two.
Well, I was a little worried about that.
Yeah.
When they interviewed me shortly after I got there, this reporter from the Des Moines paper came.
Yes.
And he asked me a bunch of questions. He was very friendly. And he got all done. He said, I said to him, that's a good number of questions you answered, but the one you didn't ask me is, how did I feel about being an American that went over to another country, elsewhere in the world, and helped them surpass them in production? Mm-hmm. And you didn't ask that. Well, he said, I didn't, but if I had asked it, what would you say? And somebody else told him, no good reporter in Iowa would pick on a visitor on an occasion like that.
Yes, that's right. They pick on the guys like me who live there.
Yeah, that's a good thing.
Yeah.
I remember your record in the Vietnam War. Good to have you out there.
That's right.
But
To be shot in the soybean war would be...
looking ahead into the next 20 years, and tell me to shut up if I'm talking too much, but I think the prospects are still good to get a lot more production out of more acres. One of the things this gentleman that wrote the article in the Wall Street Journal, he started off by saying that, you know. And I know that's true. There's a lot of land. Individual farmers may have a huge acreage that they just have in reserve, or they like the looks of those old plants that are out there. They don't have to farm it all. Some of them have it as a contribution to their country to keep some land like it was. But they've got a lot of expansion potential. And there's more yields that can be gained on those fields that are already brought into production. Now this is a sustainable kind of agriculture because it's constantly been increasing. And we're going back now 50 years. The work that I did there was in 1956 to 61. And the yields are just a lot better now. And they're very aware of the sustainability question. It's not too hard for them. The soil there is so deep. It was eroded a lot. It was almost bare most of the year. And I won't go into that detail, but it was, you could walk across some of those lands and just say, oh, well, half the ground isn't covered with anything. It's just bare soil. Never been farmed by anybody, and it's bare soil. And you could walk across it and just say, I'm going to see how far I can walk without touching any grass. And you could walk a long way. And to keep a cow, the only one animal that would sustain out there was bovine animals, and they need about 15 acres of land per cow, and they could produce a calf per year. And that was very poor. Now, well, our figuring in the beginning was that we bring land under production and it would pay off with fertilizer, but the world market couldn't absorb the amount of food that they could produce. And they'd probably move over into more pasture and raise animals and sell beef. It didn't happen that way because the world wanted so much more soybeans. I'm sure, well, the soybeans are a new crop, you know. Dr. Bradfield, who was our head at Cornell Soils, was from Missouri. And he said when he was a student, why they had the biggest collection of soybean varieties in the world, or in the United States at least, and probably in Europe. China has the biggest collection. But they had about 5 acres. Well, and when I was doing experiments there, I was the biggest soybean farmer in Brazil because I had about 4 acres.
That's great. Hey, Colin, I think you've hit on a really interesting question. You talked about, increased crop yields and about treating the soil. Pedro talked about doubling or tripling crop yields. We're sitting here in the biotechnology building at Cornell, and so far nobody said the magic words, biotechnology, genetically modified crops. I can tell you in Des Moines there are people planning now about how they're going to try to storm into our building. I feel like Benghazi there. We're defenseless. I would like to have Keegan and Catherine to put them at the door there to protest about this. All these intense feelings. I mean, so is it possible to have the crop yields without these double or triple crop yields? Maybe to ask all of our laureates, without genetically modified crops? Can we deal with the environmental issues that are, of saltwater intrusion, floods and drought, and it'll affect smallholder farmers? Can you have sustainability, or are these things antithetical to each other?
Well, on that score, I mentioned, I think you can improve the production on all of those cerrados and all of the farmlands of this country practically. I could show you examples in Cayuga County. Take you about 45 minutes to get from Cornell University to fields that don't get enough lime, and they don't produce what they can. The wheat will be dying out from from aluminum toxicity. It's not away from it. And that county has innumerable farms that have been brought back into production. They're not very good, but they're improving. But my view on it is we can do it, but I don't think doubling yields per acre is that's a long run thing. Now, we did more than that in Brazil, and it can be done in India, I think, and West Africa.
So let me ask Per and Pedro to comment on this issue, because I think it's.
Well, I'd like to just say what I'd say to the governor. The president. I think the biggest problem is, well, I might say we had a member of our group there that I was last with in Washington, and his name, he became the director of the Water Institute in Sri Lanka, and he was a guy that did a lot of thinking just on his own head and not bothering to tell anybody what he was thinking about. But he wrote.
Sounds like me.
You talk more than he does. We can always sneak around and find out what you really think. But Dave wrote this article, and I believe he was an engineer by training, but he thought more like an economist. And I mean that as a positive.
Thank you. That's very good.
Good save, Colin. Good save.
Well, he looked at the population figures for all different countries, and he found, lo and behold, in spite of everybody around was scared about the world population. We used to get letters when I worked for the Rockefeller Foundation New York office. I was the newest man on that desk, and I had to answer all the critical letters that came in, and they came in numbers. And especially there were two graduates at Cornell University. I forget what their name was, but they wrote a book called Famine 1984, and they were sure that the world was going to starve to death in 1984. The Rockefeller Foundation was scared about something like that, but they were more cool-headed about it. What they said was they were going to stop making contributions for medical research and work in agriculture, that the biggest problems facing the world was enough food, and they would spend themselves out of existence if necessary. They didn't go out of existence, and thanks to Bill Gates, they still have a good program coming along. But I don't know about that program really, but I'm sure it's got a lot of merit. But when all of this was showing up about 20 years ago, and that paper by my friend from agricultural engineering, he wrote this paper, and he showed that there were big errors in the data that people were looking at, and he blamed the UN for a good bit of that. And they had a way of collecting those data, and they'd have a low estimate and a high estimate of what the yield, what the population would be. And he said that those types of data, they always take the high estimate of population, and then the next thing they'll have some strange of that left or increased by further data. And if you go back and look at it, most of those countries are way below the estimated future. And some of them, in the case of China, they've dropped their population growth rate. Now, not their population. He was dealing about the population growth rate. And China did it by deliberate. Europe did it for reasons that are unexplainable by any data that was put forth at that time or that I've heard of. But population growth rate in, let's say, Italy, which used to be, I know my friends that served in Italy during World War II, where their stories were around the families there. So big families and lots of kids and so on. Not so anymore. It's not growing. And many of them are shrinking. And that's what the gist of his thing was. And it was done arithmetically that people couldn't argue with it. And I know there was an article in the Barron's Financial Weekly, which is one of our outstanding weekly papers, and that's something. And Warren Buffett had just said that he was leaving his wealth, which is up in the billions of dollars, to the UN because of the population program. And on the front cover, they said, "Why now, Warren?" And they picked up this paper.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're getting close to being out of time. So I'd like to give Per and Pedro a chance to talk about the other issues. So
Okay. All right.
is that okay?
Sure.
That population on there. So and this the question I raised about GMOs, biotech. It's always good when laureates fight, and gets.
It's a very good question, and I know
Yeah.
which side I'm going to be on in the demonstration in Des Moines. I'm going to be right behind Keegan as he defends our honor. No, I do not believe the world can achieve sustainable food security for all without the use of modern science, including genetic engineering. That is conclusion I've come to based on many years of study of this topic. It's possible that I'm wrong, but I don't believe so. I think we do need to mobilize modern science. We need to include genetic engineering and other kinds of molecular biology-based research. Here's my concern if we don't do this. We're going to be, the world's agriculture is going to be attacked by certain plant diseases, by certain insects, by certain problems for which we do not have solutions without the use of genetic engineering. I'm talking about transgenic approaches. And Ronnie can talk to this a lot more he knows a lot more about this than I do. We all know, I'm sure, the papaya story. We wouldn't be eating papaya if it hadn't been for genetic engineering. We have 2 or 3 major risk factors right now that we need to deal with. And as far as I'm understand it, Ronnie, but again, I'm only an economist, but as far as I understand, those problems cannot be solved without transgenic approaches. We need transgenic approaches to drought tolerance. So there are a number of risk and uncertainty factors that if we don't use modern science, we are probably not going to solve them. And guess what happens when we run out of wheat in this world, or we run out of corn in this world? What's going to happen to food security? So yes, let's use modern science. Anybody who comes to Des Moines demonstrating better have a very good argument why we should not use genetic engineering. Am I clear enough?
Crystal clear, sir. Per is an economist with chlorophyll. By that I mean that he understands the biophysical side of agriculture, and I must say, not very many agricultural economists do. So thank you, Per. I will nuance your answer by saying, yeah, it could possibly be done without GMOs, but it would be silly to do it, because it would be totally silly to do it, because it's such a powerful technique that that people that is already BT corn and BT cotton is showing that you can protect these plants against insect pests, and they kill the insect pest because of this bacillum in their DNA, and they don't kill all the good bugs that are around, giving us integrated pest management. It's good for the environment, and we don't realize that. There are many over there already. The drought-tolerant corn is in Africa, just beginning. When that happens, that would be, sir, I think another world food price. When that happens, so yeah, the answer to me is very clear. We must use all our science and technology, and it's also a very interesting part of an argument about GMOs that hasn't been explored. Do you guys know that medicines have a lot of GMOs in it? Tremendous amount of GMOs are going into the development of insulin and all that. And how come we're not worried about that? What's wrong with this picture? We're having all those medicines that are produced by GMOs and nobody complains about. But you worry about the precautionary principle that so far has not been proven, that GMOs are supposed to be dangerous to human health or the environment, and it has not been proven at all. So I think we have to, a lot of these things are not science, but politics. So I'll wear my Kevlar vest when I go to the World Food Prize in a couple of weeks and shout the same thing. I'm not a plant breeder, I'm a soil scientist. And I strongly believe in GMOs and many, many future technologies like that, like Per said.
On that. So, okay, thank you for that. Now, I know that I'm trying to anticipate, I think, what Norm would say at the G20. And I look down to Ronnie Kaufman and see if he nods his head this way or this way when I say. But I think Norm Borlaug would walk in and he'd say to those leaders, you better understand that since human agriculture started 11,000 years ago, this is the biggest challenge agriculture, and indeed the biggest challenge human beings have ever faced, whether we can do this or not. And I think he'd say, there isn't enough urgency being given to this by any of you, including whoever happens to be the President of the United States, and that this needs to be the biggest priority that you deal with. And that he would say that on every campus at every American land-grant university and every campus of every university around the world that does agriculture, that the College of Agriculture is now the single most important institution and part of that institution. Because that's where the science and the answers are going to come from. But he'd say it won't happen unless you leaders all, have the political will to do it. And so I want to ask each of the 6 panelists for at most a 30 seconds to 45-second answer in the end and say, what's your best estimate? Are we going to make it? Are we going to produce all the food, have it be nutritious enough, sustainable, and distributed for everyone in the world? Understanding it can't be perfect, but are we going to meet this challenge? Cynthia?
I think that we are. I think that because we have programs like the World Food Prize who reach out, and though they may be just a group of 10 or so hauled up in the office trying to defend themselves from the protesters, they have a hidden army of at least 150 students every year who they send, who they just enlighten and who they teach about world hunger and about GMOs and about what we need to be doing. So I would say that, yeah.
Pedro?
I think I was tempted to be an economist and say on one hand and the other hand, but I think
You're not going to take that, right?
I think maybe my head tells me that yes, it can be done. Yes, it will be done. We have a lot of degrees of freedom. It's an advantage in a way that Africa has such slow yields because it's very easy to go on the sharp part of the response curve, relatively easy. No. So, but it all depends on politics. I think if we have a peaceful world, a reasonably compatible world, it will happen. If we're still having the situation right now that there are many countries embroiled in civil war, there is no, anyway, if we have that, it's going to be more difficult. It will happen in some countries and not in other ones.
Okay. Alyssa?
So, but I'm of course, I'm an optimist.
Okay. Alyssa, your 30 to 45 seconds.
Yeah, I would also agree. I think that we definitely can and will make it as long as it becomes a priority in every aspect of education and politics.
Fair?
The world will have enough food to feed everybody. It will not be done sustainably, and there will still be lots of people who won't have access to it by 2050.
Alden?
Yes, I do believe. People don't realize how much technology is impacting our lives, and I think technology is an exponential growth, and so by that time, most definitely.
Okay. Colin? 30 seconds.
Well, I'm in favor of the future, and I think there's enough to handle a much larger population than we now have. some of the things that we run out of. Probably the one that will be the most critical will be water. There are some nutrients that are scarce, like potassium. There's still plenty of potassium out there that can be mined, but it's one. And there's lots of potassium in the natural soils of the country. But the big thing is what's the demand going to be? And I think there's
Population.
no doubt but what the farmers of this country can feed all the people that we're talking about.
Okay.
But what happens, 100 years after 2000?
How many people are there want to eat? Okay, so President Scorton, being a smart guy and running an institution like this, would say, well, I've heard from the students, I've heard from the laureates, I've heard from the I'm going to come now and ask the whole university body, and that, what's your idea? What do you have to say? What questions you want to raise? So there's some microphones here, someplace, right? There they are back here. Hands are being raised.
What's the role of NGOs?
Wait for the, yeah, okay.
What's the role of NGOs going forward?
And who wants to take answer? Okay.
I'll try that if I may. They're part of the mixture, and they can be, if they are constructive NGOs that really honestly want to solve this problem. Many of them are great, and they're part together with the private sector, together with the public sector, together with academia, etc. Now they're confrontational NGOs who have a different agenda, and they certainly do not help.
And that. So, question over here. And if anybody else on the panel wants to jump in, but if we can, we'll get as many people from the audience into the conversation.
I guess my question to the panel would be, in considering increasing yield, as several of you mentioned, could you speak to the effect that would have in terms of carbon emissions and climate change?
Who's somebody else? Who's got this carbon emissions, climate change? Anybody? All right.
It obviously depends on how it's done. There are sustainable ways of increasing food production, and there are unsustainable ways. And by sustainability, I'm talking about the contribution that we make to climate change. So it's really only a matter of how that production is going to be carried about. My argument is that there is no political will to assure sustainable production increases, taking into account the negative climate effect at this point. As long as China, the United States, and a few other major countries won't participate in that and make that their goal, we're going to continue to increase greenhouse gas emission at very rapid rates. My country thinks it can solve the world's problems by cutting back on greenhouse gas emission, but of course it makes absolutely no difference what these small countries are doing. The other point I want to raise is that I disagree with Pedro about doubling and tripling production. We need to get the institutions right so that the people who don't currently have access to food can get access. Zambia basically doubled its corn maize production over a very short period of time. They now have huge storage. They have a lot of maize, corn in storage. It is rotting. Thailand has 18 million tons of rice in storage. Malawi expanded its production tremendously. The world knows how to increase production. It does not know how to make sure that increased production gets to the people who don't have enough to eat.
May I have a little,
Pedro, please.
A little change? I don't think we're disagreeing at all. Remember what I said, double or tripling yields in different places with emphasis on micronutrient nutrition and an efficient value chain. And in an efficient value chain, sir, maybe you weren't listening to me, and I put in the infrastructure, and I put in the fact that that you have to predict surpluses and know how to deal with them. Malawi did. And of course, if you produce too much and you have no place to go, you're in trouble. All that has to happen. That's why there isn't a single one-word answer to this issue. It requires at least a sentence.
All right, yeah.
You have to help people out of poverty so they can afford to buy the food that this wonderful supply chain is going to make available to them. You didn't mention poverty alleviation.
Well, Alyssa and I are getting ready to bail here. It's every woman for herself. Here, yes, yeah, down here. Where the microphone? Oh, one over there. We'll come back to you in a second. Yeah. Okay, all right. So fighting the audience is even better. Yeah.
I'm in charge of the IRD undergraduate program here at Cornell with Ronnie. And I come back to Borlaug's comment. I worked with Norm Borlaug for 20 years with Singer.
Wow.
And he brought up the thing, we need to train the next generation of young people. Not just at Cornell, not only in developed countries, but also in developing countries. And to me, Alyssa is, in her example, is something that we need to think about. We require all of our students to at least spend 2 months or more, preferably longer, getting a hands-on experience overseas. Matching them up with students in their countries or having students from developing countries come here. The problem is, we try to do that, but the resources to do it need to be made available. We need to have support at this level to prepare the students. They have to travel there, and then we have to provide support for the people at the other end so that they can give a meaningful hands-on experience. And so I'd like to hear something from the panel on that particular topic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, anybody want to? And that, I have the World Food Prize, so you saw Cynthia is there. Catherine's here. Stand up, Catherine, here. So both of them, high school kids. The World Food Prize, this year I sent 22 of them for exactly 8 weeks working at an international agricultural research institute. Absolutely right. How can we do this? Because that's the way to inspire them while they're in high school. So you see these 3 young people who are here got inspired that way, but we need to do more. But the easiest thing to raise money for is youth experiences and youth education. Pedro,
Yeah. When I was a graduate student here, it was no problem. I had a Ford Foundation assistantship. When my wife, who's a bit younger than I am, was a student in North Carolina State, she had no problem. She had a USAID assistantship. She graduated in the 80s. Right now, when I spent 10 years as Director General of ICRAF, the Agroforestry Center, we have all sorts of students coming from Europe, coming from Japan, coming from Australia, financed by the governments one way or another one. We have very few Americans. There is a lost generation, quite frankly, a lost generation that now we can't expect to go back from a university point of view to the good old days that USAID had all sorts of money and boy, they loved you and the 211D and all that stuff. That's history. What we have to do is develop new, innovative resources, way how to do it. But I think there is an American issue, and by American, I not only mean the American students, but the foreign students who are at American universities. We're getting behind, and we're going to be hurting because now the leaders are going to be coming, the leaders from the developed countries are going to be coming from Europe and other places like that because they're putting somehow their money where their mouths are. We can't depend on the government. Let's do something else.
So the best birthday present that Norman Borlaug could ever get on his 100th birthday would be if every land-grant institution had, as Cornell will have this Saturday, a youth institute. So this Saturday here on this campus, there'll be high school students brought to the campus to be inspired and to become interested in this. But just imagine, and here's what President Skorton could really do when he's at the APLU meeting in November, is stand up in the middle and say, let's every one of us, every president, commit to we're going to have a World Food Prize Youth Institute on our campus. We're going to reach into every high school in our state. and encourage them, every one of them, to write the Norman Borlaug essay that Keegan and Catherine and Lisa Fleming think up. And you're going to pick the best students, and this is the best part, and bring the best science students to your campus so you can recruit them. And there, as we're doing, as Catherine does at Iowa State, and we're going to inspire the next generation of American high school students to be involved in this the way Cynthia and Alyssa and Alden are. That's the best thing we could do for Norman Borlaug for his legacy. So sorry for my filibuster. Next question, comment. You still have the microphone over there? Oh, he gave it back. Wow.
My name is Amir. I am coming from Pakistan, and I am a Humphrey Fellow at Cornell. From the Green Revolution, billions of people actually benefited. But you know, the Green Revolution is patented, it is protected, and the developing and the low-income countries are not benefiting from this technology. So my suggestion to President Spartan and G20 nation countries that they should establish a world fund to deal with the royalties and to pay the royalties at least for the food crops. I'm not talking about the commercial crops like cotton and other crops, but at least for food crops, there should be a world fund to pay the royalty to the companies like Monsanto and others. Thank you.
Yes, that idea has been discussed in several quarters. It is being applied, I believe, in the health sciences, and that's certainly something that should be further pursued. As far as I know, it doesn't exist for patents in crops. Pedro may know more about that. Does it exist yet, Pedro, or is it just being discussed?
No, no laws, but of all companies, Monsanto has now for several years given its genes for drought tolerance and other ones to the national institutions so they can produce their own varieties or hybrids of maize. They also were the first ones to develop the rice genome, and they gave it away for nothing. I think they should improve their own advertising on public relations just to show that they're doing these things and nobody knows. So there's something like that. But I agree with Bert that just because one major company is doing it as a goodwill gesture, which they don't capitalize on, unfortunately, but it should be all of them, and it should be the key food crops that are really in crisis, as you very well said.
Yes, Chad Dillot from the United Nations. I'd like you to comment to a couple points. One about relationships and gaps, because I think we're certainly in the need to have understanding that the dialogue and debate are two different subjects, and there's a relationship between two, and I'm not sure if we're all ready for dialogue. Certainly we're ready for debate. But I want to say something about the whole dynamics of the voices involved in this discussion. Certainly the 20G have a voice, but then everyone else has a voice. All those other countries have a voice as well. We don't always hear it, nor do we hear the relationship, but also with the NGO point as well. And also I think there's another, so that's a relationship discussion. I'd like if you could comment. There's another point about, there was a discussion about agriculture way before Cornell, way before the state of New York, way before the United States. I think oftentimes that IK, that indigenous knowledge, is not always included in the discussion. Consequently, we end up off on another tangent about science and a debate on science. Also, I'd like to comment some comment to also the point about precautionary principle and cumulative impact assessment. Certainly two major concepts in theory, in policy, and consequently, again, is there proof in precautionary principle, or is it part of a process? I think that's one point. Also, another point about relationships. The Blue Revolution and the Green Revolution, Blue Revolution, there's oftentimes we don't have a relationship between the two. And there was a point of it that being it was a revolution, not an evolution. Very two different points about how process goes along. It was a revolution. And I think we oftentimes forget that. That's a key concept maybe to other points as well. Lastly, the relationship between policy and politics, as was mentioned, key part of the conversation that we seem to be missing. Oftentimes, as the young gentleman mentioned, the waste is about politics, not about production. And I think if we don't get our hands around politics, I think the production vision that you all pointed out is not hopeless, but I think it really turns a different place. And I think we really need to get our hands around the politics of food, of security. And it's a larger issue of security, as mentioned, about water as well as the food. Because if you're drinking bad water, you're eating good food, I don't know if you're going to survive. And lastly, the relationship between the original land grant, which are revisiting their mission, and the black land grant, there's a reason for that to be created. And then the Indian land grant, there's a reason each of those went on. The relationship between the three hasn't always been maximized. Certainly there's activities between the three, but it doesn't seem like there's as much as could be happening to influence the discussion today. So that's the point I wanted to make. And the last point, for sure, is the point was mentioned about agreements. And when you said agreements, I felt treaties. The key part of agreements, and I don't want to go into all that detail now, but the key part of agreements is enforcement.
Exactly.
And a firm commitment to the agreement.
Exactly.
Otherwise, it's paper,
Sure.
and it means very, very little outside of a nice write-up someplace. So I think the opportunity we have is significant. I think we need to embrace it like we never have embraced anything before. Because it's not just survival, it's the quality of our survival. And I think that's a key. That's a key to discuss. And without going into great detail, population as well is another topic related to the conversation today. So any comments, any of that, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Sure. I just want to say something about the reaching into the historically black land grants and also into Native American Indian universities and programs, and that we have another relationship which Keegan works on with USDA called the Wallace Carver internship program, named for Henry A. Wallace and George Washington Carver. And we are endeavoring through that to also provide opportunities that USDA would have to do, but to bring students from those institutions and those backgrounds into this process, because it's extremely important to be able to have your inspiration, which is reaching out into all of those institutions. So we've got about 4 minutes left on our time, and I wanted to give the 3 students a chance for, you've been here listening to all this comment, all these senior people and laureates, and you have in 30 or 40 seconds any takeaway from all of this? Anything that you've heard or that struck you, that stands out? Doesn't have to be a conclusion, but Alyssa, yeah? And if not, if it's been a wasted morning, I understand. I'll feel bad. Don't say that.
Yeah, it definitely has not been a wasted morning. I think that I've definitely taken away a lot from this panel, and I think a lot has been said about kind of a whole coming together and really uniting and really putting this on the forefront of policy and education and everything. So I think it's a really good one.
Yeah, I think they're definitely not wasted. A wealth of knowledge, basically. Everybody's kind of saying different things, but in a way, it's all the same kind of topics and same sort of answers. But yeah, I think it was wonderful to be here, and a lot of great things were said that I'll definitely research.
This was really an excellent panel, despite it from just being like an escape from my interdevelopmental psychology class, which is always nice. It's amazing to be here and to hear such experienced people talk about hunger and really know deeply what they're talking about. I've spent a lot of time working with students in China over the past couple months, and everybody's got a good idea, but I think it was really amazing to be invited to be on this panel and to be here with these scientists. And despite everything I've been through with the World Food Prize, I still get really giddy every time I get invited to talk to scientists about hunger. And I think I learn a lot every time. So thank you.
Okay. That when Norm Borlaug went to Mexico in the 1940s, there were no international agricultural research programs, period. And now there's a structure all around the world. It's amazing what's been achieved, and should be such a matter of such pride that American universities were at the forefront of it, and it should be a matter of such incredible pride that Cornell has played its role in terms of not just the laureates and faculty associated with the World Food Prize, all the many, many distinguished people. So I want to have sort of one minute to talk again. Get your hat back out, Pedro, or so, and just say another word about Cornell and what it's meant for international agriculture and development in the future in 30 to 40 seconds, because we're about to go over time.
Well, what it meant to me, it made me a man. I was an 18-year-old kid when I came here. 10 years later, 3 degrees, 2.5 years in the Philippines, made me a man, made me a scientist, and this gets a little emotional, and it's not what I learned at Cornell only, and the whole atmosphere here, which I think is still unique. I came back for my 50th anniversary of my graduation, and it's even better. The place looks a lot better, and of course it has grown in knowledge. I learned English to start with. I had to join a fraternity house to do that.
I've heard that before.
Because I was hanging around with all Latinos, having great time and so on, so I learned English, and I became assistant treasurer, and I had to get up every month and say, your house bills are due today, and in spite of the accent they paid. The fraternity also helped me in terms of leaderships and politics and so on, and one time I had problems with immigration to become an American citizen. Although I had a green card and I had to go to the Philippines, I didn't have a passport. So 2 of my fraternity brothers had connections, one with a senator in Florida, another one with a congressman in New York, and they got together and passed a private bill that said at the end, signed by President Johnson, that said at the end, Pedro Sanchez can become a citizen provided he meets all the requirements except residence.
That's the legacy of Cornell. It's
That's
the
the
political
legacy.
connections.
Doggone it, it was my fraternity house, it was Cornell, and I won't mention names, but one of those people is very well known to you.
Okay,
That's what Cornell had.
As most of you know, Cornell is a place of creative anarchy. You can do whatever you think should be done, and Cornell will support you. This is a wonderful place to do exactly what you think should be done. I've interacted with outstanding students and outstanding faculty. I retired a couple of months ago, and there are times when I think that was a mistake. But nevertheless, it's been wonderful. Let me end on one point. It goes back to the policy versus politics. Whether we're going to achieve food security for all in a sustainable manner tomorrow or by 2050 really depends on whether those in power make the right decisions in the sense of food security. And that's true whether it's G20 or whether it's developing country governments themselves. The rest of us are in the hands of policymakers. If they make the decisions that are needed, we will have a wonderful world. There are days when I'm optimistic and there are days when I'm pessimistic.
Okay, Colin, final word, last minute for you. What does Cornell mean to you or meant to you or the future?
Well, it's sort of my second home, I guess. And it's always been a high, always willing to help me and never put any restrictions on me. Yeah. And it's a great place.
Wow, thank you. So the one thing I'm sure of is if Norman Borlaug did walk in here today, he'd be wearing a Cornell jacket because President Skorton would have sent it to him and said, I don't want to see you on my campus without that. So thank you to all of the panelists for a great conversation and